It's a wonder what eventualities come together for something like the Third Reich to embrace a concept like master race, a fundamental arrogant posture with an absolute in its reason. Their interest in epigenetics is improvement being violating, and short-sighted, but in all maturity to nature ask what this particular time had to say to the relative content, far-seeing and trivial before it called itself advanced by their means. That's the difference. It's convergence made by something not able to have that insight anymore. It wouldn't be until 1946 that the first successful genetic recombination was demonstrated, a methodically more enlightened approach to an otherwise brutish and, in a time that wasn't ready. I wondered if it was not a gesture of maturity out of sight and called to question by science given what the world had just went through. If I knew that one day my personal interest and insight as a teenager would come to ask me to be patron to the medians of ethic and arrogance and their nuances, I would have probably said, yeah, that makes sense, to be honest. But as it stood, for reasons pertaining to the ominous, respect, and enlightenment, I have a vigilance with the devil's advocacy and the nuance of certain issues for personal reasons. Circa 2017, our biogenetics are in infancy but in intrigue. We can re-clone stem cells from their own base source now, we can clone a sheep, intervene in the growth of a plant. And most recently we demonstrated recombination on the human fetus. The scientist who did that was arrested officially, as it seemed like a gesture of defiance as well as intrigue. We wonder why. Our inventions are only as good as our why, that much is determining, and just because, even for science, is not good enough obviously, but there enters every ethic that the subject matter could elicit at once. What's now more implicating is, the limits of creativity meeting some sort of impressing will, where I suppose in the referencing or intervening, the limits of that which affects and then takes when sequencing, asks for restraint, to as it were, play God. When what's not in control gets compensated for. That's humility, but that's simple as a narrative right now though, I'm just placing its implication here for now. Actually what's perhaps at question is how it does in fact in theory pan out hypothetically speaking as a process, as an incremental and probably otherwise mediating application in all honesty, but the scare in the future still comes from poignant places. Intervening, and replacing a gene sequence at early development, asks what we have decided we still held important to us. It introduces all of the unease even at its most benevolent, what makes us ready to be this direct with ourselves. We understand in an intimate sense what an expecting mother might feel, when in the benevolence of the subject, a doctor having taken a biopsy, approaches them, and says we have identified the duplication of the 21st chromosome, in other words, Down syndrome, would you like to intervene? That's scary, and obviously personal, and we are asking about who we are when we are deciding where our diverting regards for what we recognize as valuable are. At the most conscious of times. The fact that that should be brought to question here, only so insecurely, emphasizes the point of a readiness in our consciousness as it is. So with that in mind, we are young, and this is not our time for this right now. I think we could all know ourselves at a rudimentary ethic at least, about genetics. There's literally an entire film franchise, and toy line dedicated to the bottom line of a question which is, could you? Should you? And at the consideration of what we have to say to our respect in the distant future, benevolently, the answer is yes. Just not as a fashion statement. But market value being the measure of value here finally reminding us once again, we are not the people who will undertake this right now. The catch-22, science is done at the theater of its learning curves. We will likely do so anyways. Medicine, not markets, should mediate those lines. Otherwise, our maturity and application in the future, what we decide to intervene with, is not decided by a people of whom useful was momentary, but where, worth it, in all foresights, could be asked by us. Enter our epochal struggle.